Silpunk, xenophobia, and science fiction. For the uninitiated, only one of these words should be familiar. Fear not, for in this podcast we will define what these three words mean, along with analyzing Chinese science fiction and the representation of Chinese culture both in China and around the world. Hi, my name is Derek Zhu, and I will be interviewing a graduate student named Jiangfeng He here at the University of Washington. In this podcast, we will also analyze a critically acclaimed work of Chinese science fiction. The Three-Body Problem is the first book in a trilogy written by Liu Cixin and translated by Ken Liu. As a general summary, the story is about a complex struggle between humans and an invading alien species. The story was originally written in Mandarin and features a primarily Chinese cast. I would highly recommend reading the books.
Would you like to introduce yourself, Mr. Jianfeng?
I'm an English PhD student in the English department. My work is focused on 20th century and 21st century American literature and the construction of democratic sociality.
In general, literature in the West has had very low amounts of ethnic representation of Southeast Asian nations, especially Chinese literature. Why do you think that would be the case?
It's so deeply and complexly intricated with global history, with the Western history of racialization and global colonial history. We're talking about literature in the West. So for non-Western literature to have a high visibility, high reception, they need to have really appealing translations. And that might be part of the problem.
The concept of translations and their appeals is the singular bridge for cross-cultural literary diaspora, especially for Chinese literature and Mandarin's complex linguistic nature. The Three-Body Problem was originally serialized in China in 2008, but did not receive widespread recognition until translator Ken Liu translated the book in 2013 for Western audiences. Almost immediately after its translation, the Three-Body Problem became critically acclaimed internationally. Mark Zuckerberg and George R. R. Martin would go on to post and blog about it on social media, and even President Barack Obama would praise the novel for its storytelling, calling it widely imaginative. Liu Cixin would go on to attribute Ken for his hard work, thanking Ken for bridging the gap between Three-Body Problem and Western audiences. In addition, Chinese science fiction literature has only recently started to blow up. Why do you think it took so long for this genre to gain popularity?
If you think of Chinese literature in PRC, to a certain degree, it kind of emerged after Cultural Revolution in the post-socialist period. The reason why it regained popularity has a lot to do with the rise of discourse of science and technology, and the opening up and the reform policy in post now China. So science fiction might have been regarded as something that is closer to scientific truth. It was seen as one way for Chinese literature to be welcomed into global literature.
Would you also say that this opening up due to the rise in the discourse of science and the increased literacy amongst Chinese citizens was socially and culturally accepted by both the authors and the populace in terms of its popularity?
Writers and public audience, they somehow thought that science fiction can be a way for literature to get rid of all these political ideological burdens, to be focused on the objective scientific exploration of humanity, of the world.
What were the effects of Chinese science fiction literature in the culture in the Chinese mainland?
So many people at the time, after the crackdown of the foregone, and after the open up and reform policy, ideological, political, cultural debates seem to enter a cul-de-sac situation. And for many people believe that for Chinese literature to have to be revitalized, science fiction and sci-fi was a way out.
After the establishment of modern China in the 1950s, government deemed Western or imperialist concepts were put on trial, with teachings, writings, and media deemed reactionary being banned. However, as time progressed and China began interacting with Western nations more, cultural fiction, especially revolving around science and technology, began to flourish. This cultural result was the changing views that Chinese citizens had towards culture and literature itself, shifting from more traditionalist beliefs to a more free form of art, writing, and reading. I hear that Chinese science fiction is also heavily scrutinized by the Chinese government's Ministry of Culture. Do you have any intrigue on the CCP's view of science fiction in general?
Political censorship has not been as much practiced on science fiction as it did on other, more conventional, more mainstream literary genres, like just literary fiction or historical novels. After the rise to global fame of Liu Cixin's three-body problem, it's just my personal guess that CCP might start seeing regarding this new upsurge of Chinese science fiction as another battlefield for ideological struggle.
In the book The Three-Body Problem, how would you say Liu Cixin represents Asian culture and history throughout the story?
With all due respect to Liu Cixin and to his writing career and to the global fame of three-body problems, I honestly find the novel problematic because there are some more social, historical, political issues that are more complex than is represented by him in the novel. That is probably the place where he has been most criticized.
Could you elaborate a bit more about the problematic themes of Liu Cixin's writing?
There's some very, very conventional toxic masculinism embedded in it, in which gender equality and the representation of women and female characters in his trilogy is kind of problematic. My feeling, based on my reading of all his three novels and some of his interviews in Chinese, I can sense that he's still holding up, subscribing to certain gender hierarchy, certain conceptions of gender hierarchy, or even pan-ethnic centrism, or if we can say it blatantly, put it blatantly like that. So it's the Chinese equivalent, the Chinese counterpart of white supremacism.
To add on to Mr. Jiangfeng's analysis, for example, at the beginning of the three-body problem, the male physics professor is the one who grasps logic even in the face of death, while his wife is shown to be far more hysterical and controlled by emotion. Examples like this show Cixin is attempting to showcase that you need a balance of logic and emotion to have a stable functioning society, which isn't objectionable in and of itself. And even saying you need a balance of masculine and feminine wouldn't be objectionable. But perhaps Liu Cixin applies a traditionalist cultural ideal by assigning logic to men and emotion to women as if they are inherent qualities. This trope or theme is used a lot throughout the three-body problem and its sequels, and perhaps show that Liu Cixin does subscribe to more traditionalist cultural beliefs. Do you think that by referencing subjects and topics such as the Cultural Revolution and small tidbits of Chinese culture, Liu Cixin introduces lesser-known cultural topics to a Western audience?
In a sense, yes. Western readers, they don't really care about among the original motivations for political leaders to launch the Cultural Revolution in the entire span of 10 years. All they care is just any materials that would work to reinforce their pre-established, previously upheld views, to learn the actual history of China and Chinese revolution and cultural revolution through reading novels. They're just reading to satisfy a certain sense of self-complacency.
So in a sense, though, Liu Cixin introduces a rather hidden and unknown era of Chinese history for many Western readers, the occurrence of something like the Cultural Revolution in the story is more so a titillating plot point that reinforces xenophobic and anti-Chinese sentiment than a cultural lesson in Chinese history. Liu Cixin's three-body problem stands as a critical pillar of modern Chinese literature. As Mr. Jiang Feng stated, Chinese science fiction in the modern age was revived and initiated by the increase in scientific knowledge and discourse. Furthermore, the popularity of the novel was introduced to the West, where the cultural implications of China's rich history offered a deeper look into the history of the Asian nation. Finally, we touched on the portrayals of social and cultural issues by Liu Cixin and analyzed the deeper implications of the three bodies' influence in modern Chinese literature.